main class to an existing table. By default, Grails is going to create a table that's named after the class name with lowercase in the first name character. So we create a member table. But we already have one called members, so we're going to tell it that our table is members, not member. Now the ID column, you're always going to have a primary key called ID on any Grails object. The object itself is going to have that. As far as what that maps to in the database, you can tell it that. So our ID column is going to be member underscore no. Otherwise, we're going to just create what's called ID. And then our email, the property is just called email, so we're going to create a column called email. But we have one called email underscore address, and so we have to map that one as well. So we create this column block here, and we list any column here that we want to change. Now I'm doing the same thing that I do with ID, I'm just telling it a column. ID is handled separately though, because right here you could also do things like tell it the sequence, key generation scheme, if you're using a sequence or something like that. So that would also be, so ID is handled differently. But any column, other columns that go in this column block, you can set the name you want to map to, you can specify a custom data type, and you can put indexes. You can do pretty much any kind of customization you need to do on your database, you can do through here. If you've used Hibernate before, all this is mapping just to Hibernate. What is it called? Basically the things in Hibernate you tell the map to your tables. So that's the mapping stuff. So with this in place, now we want to hook our app up to a real database. By default, Grails uses HSQLDB. So we have this file here called datasource.groovy, and in here it tells the database we're going to use. The driver class name is this one for HSQLDB. And then we have these different environment blocks down here. This you just specify specific information about your data source for development, which is what we're doing now. Test, when you run your tests, and production, when you generate a war. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on the development environment right now, and it's going to try to use an in-memory database that's going to have this create drop attribute, or the db create set to create drop. Now what the db create does is it tells it, do you want to create a new database every time you start the app and kill it when you're done, or do you want to just update the database, or you just want to create one and leave it after the first time. So we're going to change these things here. Also, inside this data source block at the environment level, you can override anything that's on this global one. And the more specific one will take. So we get rid of that stuff. And replace that. So now I'm going to use the driver class name for MySQL. I'm changing db create to update. And I'm setting to the URL of the database that we just looked at. And then looking at after that. I'll tell you what those are. So save that. Now Grails with this update, db create set to update, Grails will only do constructive changes to our database. It'll add columns if there's a new column that we're putting in. It will extend the size of columns, or it won't reduce them. It will set a column from, if you change it to nullable true instead of nullable false, it will set it to not null, but it won't set it back to null. So it won't be any changes to your schema that would leave it in an inconsistent state. It's really good about that. Okay, so now with this in place, we should be able to create our member and have it map correctly to the properties of this object to map to that table. And then what we'll see is this member table will still be here, and it'll have 3 new tables in here as well. Well, as soon as we run the app, we'll do that. But before we run it, we want to do one last thing. I want to create some test data so we can have some stuff to look at. We already have data in our member table, but we don't have anything on the new tables, obviously, so we're going to create that with our bootstrap. Should show you what these things are. The data source and the bootstrap that we're just opening right now are both in this Grails app /conf directory. So the bootstrap we just opened, and the data source we looked at earlier right here. These are the configuration files that Grails works with. Spring and Hibernate folders are where you can put existing XML files for Spring or Hibernate artifacts that you want to include in your Grails application. So you can use for domain classes in Grails, you can use existing Hibernate objects. But while we're looking at this, real quick, I want to mention one other thing. This source folder down here, there's a source Groovy and a source Java. This is just a place to put arbitrary source files that will be compiled when you build your war. They'll be compiled and included in your war file. So any utility classes you have, helper classes, that kind of stuff, you put in there. But the neat thing about this folder is it's extensible through plugins. You can also use Clojure or Scala. So it'll create if you install either of those 2 plugins, it'll create either a Clojure directory in here or a Scala directory in there. And then you can put Scala or Clojure source files right in the directory and it'll call the appropriate compilers to compile those and include them in your OR. So if you have some portions of your app that would be better suited in one of those languages, you can go and use it right in your Grails application pretty seamlessly. I went to that talk to Scholar earlier. All right, so now we in our Bootstrap, we're going to add some data. Okay, let's talk a bit about what I did here. First thing I'm doing here, this init block here is going to be executed every time you start the application. The destroy and execute when you end it. So in here, I'm doing a check to see if we already have any data. I'm doing that by calling the list method on the speaker class. Now we saw our speaker class over here. There's no list method anywhere on there, right? But it will exist at runtime. You don't have to write it. When you create a Grails domain class, by virtue of the fact that it's in the domain directory, a whole bunch of methods are added to it dynamically at runtime. One of those is list, which just does a select star, basically, from the database. But it also has save, get, to retrieve a single object, delete, and a bunch of finders which we'll look at in a minute. So right now we're going to do a list. I'm just going to pull back any data. Now Groovy has this concept of Groovy truth, where certain values that are not normally Boolean will be evaluated as Booleans in a Boolean expression. So in this if block, I can put in just the list here itself, speaker.list. The result of that method would be an array list, or it would be null, or it might be an empty array list. But null values evaluate to false. Empty lists evaluate to false. So if this method here returns either no data or returns null or an empty list, then that would evaluate to false, and so I'll know there's no data yet. Right, so basically I'm saying if there's no data, then go ahead and create these things here. I'm doing that so we're doing the duplicates. So I'm going to create a new speaker, and I'm using here the Groovy named argument constructors. All objects in Groovy, either Groovy objects or Java objects that you're calling within Groovy code, have a named argument constructor. So just passing the properties and then the values as basically it's a hash map. So it comes down to key value pairs. After you set these values, then we call save. Again, the save method is one that's added dynamic. This is all part of GORM, Grails Object Relational Mapping, which is a very dynamic wrapper on Hibernate. So we're saving that one. We'll create 3 speakers. We'll save each of them. And then when we create a meeting, the meeting set the properties like we did up here, except for the speaker, we're going to retrieve the speaker from the database. We're just save, so we're going to call this find by last name. So speaker.find by last name. Now this is a method that doesn't exist and wasn't added for us until we called it. So again, it uses Groovy's method missing handler so that when we call this method, it sees the find by. It recognizes it's not a real method. There's no find by last name existing in the code base. So it's going to follow the method missing. It's going to see the pattern here. The find by is going to check the values after that and see if that's a valid property. Okay, and since last name is a property, it'll then turn that into an HQL query and pull back the first object you find with that last name. There's also a find all by that returns a list instead of a single object. Right now there's not a single object. We really only want that name, so we can do that safely. Okay, so that's the dynamic finders. The dynamic finders, you can use any of the properties in the object. Only top level properties, you can't do properties of an associated property. You can do the associated property and pass in the object itself. So I can do a meeting.find by speaker and pass a speaker object into it. But I could do meeting by find by speaker first name, like that. So top level objects, and up to 2 of them, combined with and or. So I can do find by last name and first name, if I want to be more specific. And then just pass that one 2 arguments instead of 1. So that will work as well. Okay, so those are dynamic finders. So we'll set those things and we say, and this is giving us some speakers and some meetings to have to show some stuff. All right, now that all in place, run it and hope it works. Run it in development mode, which is Grails run-app. And we go. I had a note myself, not to read this, I forgot it anyways. The Bootstrap is not in a package. Because your Bootstrap class might actually retrieve data from multiple packages, it doesn't put in one, by default those are. So we're going to look for it. Try that again. Now what runs it, what's going to do do is going to load an embedded Tomcat instance. So Grails ships with Tomcat, and so in development mode you can run it, and it'll have a container up and running for you on port 8080. You can specify the port if you want to use a different one. If you want more than one instance running, you can change the port. And you don't have to deploy in Tomcat. You can build a standard JUnit war, so you can deploy any container that's out there, WebSphere, WebLogic, JBoss, whatever you're using. But it comes with Tomcat embedded for convenience for us developers, and it really is handy. All right, so now with that running, navigate to that URL. Oh, I did miss a step. Oh, I know it's not. All right, so one more thing we need to do. We have the data there. Actually, now I can show you this part. So if you did run it, the data is now there in the database. And the tables are there. And the data should be there too. So yeah, it's good to see that back there. There's 3 rows in our speaker and 3 rows in our meeting. So that Bootstrap data, or Bootstrap code is executed, the data was created, our tables are all here now. If you take a look at the member now, it has this new column on here called version. Version is added to all of our classes, and that's used for optimistic concurrency. So the version is incremented every time the value is saved back to the database. That way if you pull the object out, while you're working on it, somebody else writes it into the database, the version is incremented. When you go to save, there's a mismatch and it throws an optimistic concurrency error. And it won't save it. If you look at the other tables, you'll see that they have an ID for they have ID and version. Those 2 things are added to all of our objects. All right, so the thing I forgot to do, so let's do this real quickly, is we're going to generate now, we talked about the views and controllers that Grails can create for us. Now you can make our own, they're really easy to do, but just to get your basic CRUD application going real quickly, you can do it, Grails will do it for you. So we'll do Grails generate dash all. I'll just spell it right. And then you give it a class name, or we should be able to just do them all together with this. Now, generate all does is it generates a controller and 4 views. Create, show, list, and edit. And we'll take a look at all those in a minute. There's also the option of dynamic scaffolding. I don't want to show that here. It does the exact same thing that we're going to see, but it does it without generating the code. So the code's all in memory. And it's more flexible when you're first starting out prototyping. It's kind of handy, but it's an extra step I didn't want to take the time to do. So last night at the county doing this didn't work, so hopefully it'll work tonight. It worked, okay, so now we can run it. And we'll see some of the neat things that Grails gives us just out of the box, so to speak. I don't like that term used for software, since software doesn't come in boxes anymore. Anyhow, so there's just a lot of features that we get right away from the domain, from the view generation. And we'll look at some of that now. Okay, so we created these 4 controllers for us. We'll look at them in action real briefly, then we'll look at the code. So we'll start with the member. When you go to the controllers are the second part of or the first part of your URL after your root context. So right now, root context is our app name juggler, and the next thing is the controller. Now this is actually calling a class called member controller. So the convention is it just drops the lowercase is the first character and drops the controller part off. And then the list is an action inside the controller, which we'll see briefly, or see momentarily. So that's how the requests are handled to the controller and action mapping that way. We'll look at the mapping too a little bit. Here's the data we already had in our database. I had this loaded up with some extra data so we can show the pagination. Grails comes with this pagination tag we can use built in by default here, so it just works like you would expect a pagination tag to work. There's also sortable columns. They're all there for us by default. And the ID is a link to the detail page for that object. So we look at the list view, this is the show view, there's an edit view, we can edit these things. So we have these input fields on us up here. Right here, because we had that one to many and the has many and belongs to and member and interest, right? Because of that code, we